Okay, welcome, Mark. I believe, I actually can't quite believe, this is episode 5.
Yes, it's been a long journey over a very short period of time.
Yeah, and today we're going to have a look at the Humanists. So we're obviously going to be looking at the Renaissance in part. As a brief recap before the recap, because we always have to do at least 2 recaps, I'd like to just reflect on what was an epic journey of the medievals last week.
Yeah.
I'm afraid to all YouTubers who've got used to the 25-minute to 30-minute slot, I'm pretty sure that's 45 to 50 minutes, and it's not going to get cut that much. But I do want to reflect on that journey we went on, and it was a winding one, but some very interesting elements came up. I'm just going to pick up on the last thing that you said in the medievals, episode 4 of the idea of the teacher. And you said, you have to be able to have an argument, and your argument has to have clear principles and premises. And the medievals seem to hold that up. And to that extent, we're not looking back when we go to them. They're helping us look forward as teachers, which I thought was a great place to end up last week. Anything you'd like to say on that, or more generally about the medievals?
Yeah, so I stand by that, and I think, but what I didn't explain clearly enough, or didn't have time to do, is that they gave us a set of understandings of how you, when you have a shared view of what knowledge is, how do you then discuss or work out that knowledge? So they actually offered us the beginnings of the university style and secondary school style curriculum and the way that you use methods. Although I'm going to end today probably by looking at how those methods declined. But what they were saying is you have a lecture, which is originally meant to read, disputation, and something called, which Aquinas used, the quod libet, which is a free discussion. But all of them presume, not as in today's fractured world, that the persons taking part in the discussion have to consider their identity or how they are understood. That's given. It's the knowledge, it's a shared knowledge. It's not been broken down into the curriculum structure of today, although it points that way, and the Renaissance takes it forward. But it's something that everybody is equal in front of. It's not about the equality you feel for yourself. The knowledge is there. Can you go and get it? And when you say pointed forward, it's quite an interesting link, because what I brought today is a piece of artistic discussion, Richard, which again develops in the Renaissance. This is the sculpture, I hope the camera can see it, of Giovanni Pisano. And he was 1250 to 1315 approximately, working in northern Italy, not in Florence, Pisa and Pistoia. And you can see his sculpture here, the head thrust forward. And in this book, which has got an introduction by the English sculptor Henry Moore, he says that he thinks Pisano, who was taught by his father, and his father's sculpture is good, but not quite as dramatic or expressive as this. Pisano was given the framework to break forward, and then he's got these famous thrusting necks. And Henry Moore says he thinks the reason for that is he has an urgent desire to communicate with us. And obviously this is in the form of a sculptor, but it's the same principle that happens in the knowledge of the Renaissance. You find more and more individual teachers breaking away from the medieval framework, changing the way they relate to people, and even coming up with their own kind of school as there is a secularization, even though it is within that Christian framework. And Italy is the place where it begins. And it does mean that there's a tremendous pointing forward of knowledge, but some things are lost, which is the common understanding of what that knowledge is. But as today we're sitting in a science lab, some things are gained, which is that knowledge can be approached inductively rather than just deductively. And all of those have implications for how the teacher and their role is understood and changed.
Thank you. So we're going to look at the Renaissance.
Yeah.
What are we actually going to call this?
Yeah, so I think the Renaissance itself is a period that is now disputed because it's a historical term, and people now in universities call it early modern. I'm going to hold to it as I would hold to medieval because it was the Renaissance itself which gives us historical thinking in the way we understand it today, because the humanists of the period, particularly the humanists that were in government in Florence, Leonardo Bruni in particular, they wrote books which understood themselves as emerging from a previous period, the medieval period, and needing to go back to an ancient period, which is where the source of the classics were. Now, those classics had always been there in the sense that Aristotle had been used in the medieval period and Plato was known about, but the complete rediscovery and transformation of all of their texts, particularly all of Aristotle's, and the retranslation of Plato meant that there was a distinct edge to this period. It was a period which understood itself as itself, a rebirth. And I think that had repercussions for the idea of what was taught and how we teach that were unprecedented, and that we are still living through today, although we're in a period of reaction against that very clear understanding of historical periodization and what that might mean a teacher has to do with that historical understanding. But I mean, that's to come in what we say.
So when you talk about humanism and associate it with the Renaissance, do you mean the humanism of today?
Absolutely not. Although we're talking about it in this room, I think we're in a minority. I think the very studied secular humanism of today, which immediately excludes the spiritual, is not what we're talking about. And to me, I always find people are forcing themselves in the modern version of humanism to exclude the bit that is beyond themselves, which is where the opening, if you like, is between the self and where they're going to be taught to reach. There was no problem with that in the medieval period. There was beginning to be a problem with it in the Renaissance period because it was a new form of knowledge. But in the modern period where we are today, it's almost like people say, don't, cut God out. I'm not saying God's got to be there, but I think something's got to be there that is over and above the self in order to create effective teaching. I think that is one of the ideas of the teacher that I've learned in this process of talking to you. And so I think it is very, very different from that. But it doesn't mean that you're taking man out of the picture. Yes, it's about the dignity of man, and that itself creates a new framework for what kind of a person a man can be educated to become. But I think what I'm wary of increasing as we go through the weeks is that I'm aware of where the situation is today. It feels like the idea is that you should leave a person as they are, as themselves, and not see the teacher's role as to transform the student into something they may not ever have expected to become.
So Mark, you looked at Pisano. What about the others?
Yeah, so there are some others that I would call beginners of the Renaissance outlook, but they could be called medieval. Dante is one of them. And I think Dante is interesting, not just because he created a brilliant secular text, if you like, about religious themes, but because it was based on the use of Virgil, the Roman writer, as his guide. And the guide was not like a medieval kind of guide where you're taught about knowledge. He wrote so that Virgil was his mentor and his guide. It was a very personal relationship between teacher and student, and all the way through, Dante is asking for clarity on what Virgil would have done in particular situations until they get to Paradise, when Beatrice, Dante's lost love, kind of takes over. There's only so far Virgil can go. Of course, he was pre-Christian. But I think what the text shows is, apart from the incredible intellectual imagination of Dante, is that there's a beginning to be a more personal relationship between teacher and student that we haven't seen before, and that's definitely there in Dante. And there's another writer that I've mentioned before, Ockham, who's not normally part of this discussion, but he is in the same period. He seems to be doing it the same. In a way, he does end up with himself, because his principle is called the razor, which means that all knowledge is, up to that point, particularly medieval, was sort of overcomplicated, and he just says you don't need those. What's the presupposition of you saying that would be his teaching approach, and as an idea of a teacher to a student, it's just to say simplify, simplify. Do you need that excessive verbiage? But you end up with induction rather than deduction, and in a way, it's almost like Dante, but without such a romantic story to tell. And both of them were exiled, and in trouble for their views, because they did attack some form of what was going on in the medieval period, or they appeared to offer a new way for teaching and knowledge to be addressed.
So, what characterised this humanism in Italy? Yeah,
so in Italy, I've mentioned some of the ways that the medieval approach was structured, but what began to emerge, which is again a real lesson for today, is praise. Praise not just of the student. It wasn't really there yet, but it does come out of what happens. Praise for the city, the concept of the panegyric, or the oration, if you like, to a city or to a person, become the new form of educational treatise that emerges. And you get Bruni, who's Chancellor of Florence, following his own teacher or mentor, Salutati, and both of them taught by the Greek Manuel Chrysoloras rather, who comes to Florence and creates a kind of summary of the old and the new Rome. They use this to praise the city, to deliver orations to the city, and there's a split in the history of the Renaissance about whether this, inspired by the potential for an invasion of Florence by Milan, led them to pursue humanism as a republican pursuit or endeavour, which meant that they would create citizens that had a sense of identity with the city, and they would teach them from the classical period the things they needed to get that sense of freedom. The alternative view is that it was just a response to the shifting ideology of the ruling elite, and they needed, again, a new form of teaching from the classics. How do you become a good person? How do you lead? All of which takes us back to the Roman period and Cicero in particular, but which does give a clear sense that the city was trying to break away from the medieval past and create a new identity as an Italian city-state, either under pressure from other Italian city-states. The pessimistic view is that they were trying to create a kind of Florentine imperialism and actually use it to take over. But the result was that education became much more about saying, this is who we are, this is the kind of people we believe we should be, and we will create a city and a structure of education that looks like that. The particular example, which many people think started the Renaissance, is the baptistry doors in Florence and the competition between Brunelleschi and Ghiberti to design a kind of plaque, which wasn't actually ever used, but Ghiberti won the competition and went on to do the doors. The key thing that people forget is that those doors had the Old Testament theme, which was the sacrifice of Isaac. But it was done in a way that began to show the rebirth in things like perspective and classical Greek forms of art that was kind of liberating. And once this gets going, which it certainly did, and is picked up by other educators like Alberti, you start to see architecture very fully engaged, either with a rejection of what had gone before, which might be an easy way to say, rejection of the Gothic, or with a much more self-conscious rediscovery of Greek and Roman principles, such as symmetry, proportion, and harmony, all of which you see in the architecture of the city, although not as clearly as people think, and all of which you start to see in education of the human being, of what they might become, and the idea of all-roundedness, what is a Renaissance man. They can do sport as well as fight, if fighting is what you need. They can engage in proper conversations in a civil way. The idea of what it means to be civil definitely emerges in this period, and it requires a new generation of self-confident teachers to go ahead and do it, because they're definitely liberated from the religious framework, although they're not anti-religious.
I'm just trying to sort of work out how this developed. So you're saying that Florence was the kind of cauldron.
Yeah.
Are you, in looking at this as the cauldron and the catalyst before the Renaissance spread, are you trying to put an argument for this actually being the beginning of schooling as we know it? Probably,
yes. Because in the sense that they were rebuilding the city, or they'd gone, Brunelleschi, who lost the competition for the baptistry doors, you went to Rome, and Rome at that point was still seen as a ruin. Of course, the ruins were then transformed in the mind's eye into the remains of a greater civilization than the medieval period had been, and therefore the Renaissance begins as a sort of, as Leonardo da Vinci is rumoured to say, why would you use the water pots if you can go to the fountain or the source? I think Florence was the cauldron, as you put it. I'm not sure, I don't think anyone will be ever completely sure whether it was driven by external pressure or internal moves. For example, the way that the teacher-student relationship worked in art and architecture and in government and things like that. But definitely there was a drive to assert themselves, and the result was a complete breakdown of the existing curricular structure and a complete reaffirmation of what they thought the classical period had held for them, and an incredible emergence of confidence of various kinds in what you could do with education, yes, and up to and including the development of actually schools. Florence is interesting because it didn't have a university. It might be one of the reasons we can affirm the idea of the teacher today. We often say, just teach to our teachers. Perhaps because Florence didn't have a university to structure its knowledge, you then create the conditions where a group of humanists can rethink what it means to teach. And I think this is certainly where we end up with Ficino, the Platonist, who somehow set up the Platonic Academy, a kind of imitation of Plato in the past, but definitely with a view to creating a much more open-ended educational process that probably did challenge Aristotle and the medieval outlook. Yeah.
So just in terms of periodization, can we just be clear where we're at here in terms of the development of Florence?
So Florence, I would say from 1400 onwards, the baptistry doors competition is 1401 or 2, and Ghiberti wins that and then goes on to finish his first set of doors by 1425-ish. And so the whole of the 15th century, Florence is driving itself forward, and there's some other great examples just briefly to mention, and I do think it's intellectual at this period. I mean, Venice is much more visual and interested in colour and how the world looks, more of already natural, but not working out how nature works. And I think in Florence there is this drive to say, what does nature look like? Is it the model we need to imitate? That's the other concept that emerges in education. Is it imitation? What do you imitate? Is there a model of greatness or excellence that we should aspire to model? It's completely opposite to what we have today, and it's why it's so hard today to say that there could be something greater than us that we could imitate. People generally in education today don't want to hear that message, and I think it's a great one for the teacher. What is it that we could imitate? And in this period, people like Masaccio, who died very young, I think only 27, he goes paints a much more realistic version of Christian art, which shows although we had a go at the Christians in the last message, and the Christians perhaps rightly say, knowledge puffeth up. Definitely the knowledge of the human form led to this incredible realism in art emerging, and that we're still using that today as the standard of humanism. You know, you can see and be confident in the human body, in its proportion and harmony, and so what if that's not what we all look like? It's a model of excellence that we could all learn from.
Do you want to stay with Italy, or do you want to sort of
I
spread
do,
a bit? Go a
I
bit
could
further?
always stay with Italy. Yeah, I'd say there were probably some other developments in education in Italy, and let's take Ficino because I've mentioned him. So he kind of develops his academy if ever he was given a property to teach at near Florence, and that was by the Medici. So, you know, we could say the Medici were a bunch of crooks. Whatever happened in that sense, they certainly had a view of themselves as educators. I think at one point Leonardo and Michelangelo were all hot-housed by the Medici, and that didn't mean they were taught how to do their actual artistic processes. It meant they were imbibed into an atmosphere of humanism in the sense of being a well-rounded, generally educated person. And I think Ficino summarises this. He really pushes the idea that you need to be taught following the, I'll quote, and this is from a letter, follow the example of Socrates, advise your pupils to use human learning to dispel the clouds of the senses and to bring serenity to the soul. Then will the truth from the divine Son illumine the mind, and never in any other way. This is the only useful study. A man who acts otherwise labours vainly and miserable. Now he's kind of saying, a bit like the Platonic cave, liberate yourself from the senses, and that will provide this space for you to understand what you truly are, or what man can truly become. Now he does say though, no one's more deadly a murderer than a flatterer. Don't let this praise go too far. And I'll come back later to whether he's right about liberating yourself from the senses, because the modern world of science doesn't stand for that. But all praise to him, he says, who has learned without reserve and who teaches without jealousy. Whatever flows out from the pupils flows back to the teacher. I beseech you, teach without stint. And you know, it's a real statement of what teaching can be, and that what you will create is some kind of student that will aim to follow you if that's what you want them to do. I would add though that it's not for all, and Ficino is very clear. Do not admit any young men to the discipline except those of fortunate birth and the best education, for it's not fit that the muses become ministers of wantonness or the tools of iniquity. Now again, today there's plenty of people willing to say who is and isn't educated, but I'd say what we do that's better than that is we say we can teach everybody. Now, whether or not that breaks down is an interesting discussion, but the actual statement that you can teach everybody, we're ahead of Ficino on that, which is quite nice and refreshing to hear. The other example I've got is from Castiglione's Book of the Courtier, which is a famous sort of handbook of how you would create a well-educated person. It's written in the style of a dialogue, definitely has elements of Plato, but a lot of it is about the artificiality of education. I think it's a bit of another lesson about the difference between teaching what we call true knowledge and teaching behaviour or manners. In the book, there's the women in the book, although they're not in control, they run the conversation over a sort of 4 chapters. There's a very interesting section where they discuss a concept called grace, which is not grace in the sense we've looked at it in the past with the Christians, Augustine and so on. It's grace as a kind of artificial manner that makes you look more naturally natural than nature itself. So it's it's bound up with imitation and how you carry yourselves. And there's a very interesting section where the Count, one of the characters, says, I'm not bound to teach you how to acquire grace, which in the book is called sprezzatura, by the way, or anything else, but only to show you what a perfect courtier should be. Nor would I undertake to teach you such a perfection, especially when I've just now said the courtier must know how to wrestle, vault, and many other things, which, since I never learned them myself, you all know well enough how I should be able to teach them. Let it suffice that just as a good soldier knows how to tell the smith what shape, style, and quality his armour must have, and yet is not able to teach him to make it, nor how to hammer or temper it, perhaps I should tell you that a perfect courtier, what they are, I will tell you, but I'm not going to teach you what you must do to become one. So the lesson here is that there's a kind of pulling back in the responsibility of the idea of the teacher. But the way I take it is that we should be kind of eternally vigilant as teachers to kind of manipulation, because what grace or what sprezzatura seems to be is that you must manipulate yourself in order to be accomplished in social situations or to do the right thing, all of which I think is correct. I do agree with society. But the warning sign is that you're ending up in kind of trying to get a set of responses, learned responses to you, rather than checking that people really understand what you're trying to do or know. And if I ever see this in the classroom, I think you always can sense that children are aware when a teacher is trying to get them to give them a response that's already in the teacher's mind, rather than work together to work out if they know what they're trying to be taught, and are there any genuine questions about how this should be done. On the converse, the book does say a good pupil should not only do things well, but try and transform yourself into your master or teacher. And in that way, the idea of imitation, I think I like it, but it's not popular today to say that kind of things. And there's a very nice quote where they say, as in the green meadows, a bee flits about the grasses, robbing the flowers. Our courtier must steal this grace from those who have it. So learn who you need to imitate to become the person you need to be. But I'm worried that this leads to a kind of manipulative approach to education. Fortunately, perhaps, one of the later educators, Erasmus, who was in Northern Europe and comes to England and works with John Colet to set up St Paul's Grammar School and advances a much clearer idea of the understanding. He kind of turns back against this kind of grace approach and says it's in terms of the choice of material, the child must be made acquainted with the best. It's a bit like the later Victorians say, the best that has been thought and said. This implies that the master is competent to recognise the best in the mass of erudition open to him, which in turn signifies that he's read far more widely than the range of authors to be taught by him. And this applies even to the tutor of beginners. So you need to acquaint yourself as a teacher with authors of every type with a view to content rather than style. Better to classify what you read so that you can classify the matter in terms of how you're planning to teach it. So the idea comes in here that you must really teach what you know. And then he quotes, undeniably the surest method of acquisition, the practice of teaching what we know. In no other way can we certainly learn the difference between what we know and what we think we know, whilst that which we actually know, we come to know better. And I think it's a kind of lesson of, if you like, Protestant style moderation, although he wasn't a Protestant, to make sure the teacher's role is clear. And that is the other side of the humanism that's coming out of the, if you like, excesses of Castiglione's Book of the Courtier. It's a kind of saying, well, what can we actually do here when we are trying to create? And there's a sense in Erasmus of a more democratic ideal, because of course Colet's grammar school, St Paul's, was the model for the teaching of the grammar schools that would have taught Shakespeare. And then by that time, it was a much clearer sense of what the classical education should consist in. You and I were fortunate enough to be invited to the States to discuss and work on this. And it's in some ways it's more modest, but it's clearer what the classical offering will be to the student. And if it helped create Shakespeare, there must have been something good in it, although it was lacking in science. So there was elements that we can criticise.
Just to literally pull things together at the end of this session, it seems to be that you're quite critical of some of the trends that are emerging out of humanism and during the Renaissance.
Yeah.
And yet certainly some of the nature of the educational institution and what we understand by schooling seems to be being established.
Absolutely,
And your last point, if we created grammar schools that led to geniuses like Shakespeare, then it can't have been all wrong. So do you want to just sort of give me a sort of balanced weighting on this? Because most people are very enthusiastic about humanism and the Renaissance.
Yeah. Well, there's another great teacher called Vittorino da Feltre. He did set up a school in Italy. And he was very keen, again, on using, he would use Plato and Socrates, but really as a way to check that students weren't being overindulgent. So his humanism was becoming much more clearly non-religious and much more classically Greek. But it was also something new was emerging, like he was teaching physical activity as well as intellectual activity. There's very few books on him, but one that is good says that the old ideal of knowledge was replaced within a generation by a new one, and it corresponded with a deeper sense of human interest. They were wider, but it was indefinitely grasped, and the education to express that was tentative and uncertain. So it's more like, a bit like today. There was an opportunity, and a thoughtful, purposeful teacher could take that and rip up the old textbook, but come up with something better. How should a teacher, this book on Vittorino says, how should they reduce to educational method and apparatus the ancient learning that they had? But it was yielding up its secrets. I mean, it's the idea of the teacher here is that they can traverse history and synthesize, and they've got to put that work in. And when they do, if they can stay on top of the material, they are going to start to create brilliant students. And if they've got that ability about them, they will be the new generation. And Vittorino da Feltre is called here as the first modern man. But equally, we've got Francis Bacon, who again, I mean, it was tremendous when we were in the States working with liberal arts colleges. Bacon came up, and I don't think either of us had really looked at him. Francis Bacon, in his book, The Advancement of Learning, I mean, I would call him part of the Renaissance period, 1561 to 1626. But in his book, The Advancement of Learning, he attacks Aristotle. And he almost really has a go at Plato as well, because he talks about the cave. But this cave is not the way Plato portrays it. He says Plato's cave was a feigned supposition, and if a child was put in a grot or a cave under the earth until they were mature, he would have a very strange and absurd imagination. And even that language there, you can feel the reduction, probably inspired originally by William of Ockham, but he saves his worst attack for Aristotle. Where he attacks the principle of the syllogism, the idea of deductive knowledge. Their form of induction, he said, which is actually deduction, Bacon says, it's vicious, it's incompetent. Their error, though, is the fouler, because it's the duty of art to perfect nature, but they've wronged, abused, and traduced it, because the syllogism, essentially, that they use, it doesn't work. It's false. It creates knowledge in the mind that isn't truly there in reality. And what Bacon is doing is saying that the Renaissance in this discussion where we've discussed it so far, its imitation of nature isn't real nature. It's a kind of ideal view of nature symmetry, proportion and harmony, for example, but it's not the way nature truly is. And to really get at that, we need to use inductive knowledge and experiment with nature. And you see the beginning of the split between the humanities and the sciences that we inhabit today, and probably very glad that we do. But the problem, I guess, for the idea of the teacher is how do you put all those pieces back together so that you have a truly well-rounded education with the humanities and the sciences both working to drive the mind of the student forward and hopefully create, the future that we need for our students as they go forward. But Bacon is onto this. I think he's quite barren in some respects, in the same way that the Renaissance thinkers are more romantic and have got a different kind of ideal. But he's right to call out some of the excesses of the way the classical texts were reinterpreted, and he kind of strips it down and says there's a kind of zeroing effect that we can obviously also learn from. But the problem then is the teacher needs to have a really strong idea of what they're going to do because there's no fixed ground anymore once you've taken on the classics in the way that he did. And that's why I think the classics will keep coming back. But the idea of the Renaissance in general and what Bacon kind of adds to it is that you can't take anything for granted at all. And so the idea of the teacher is open, but they've then got to have a really great idea about what they're going to do with that space they've been given.
Thank you. I suppose just because that's a really interesting point, you're saying right at the end of the Renaissance, sort of, we were actually kind of moving closer towards the Enlightenment.
Yes.
Bacon unpicks quite a lot of the presumptions of the Renaissance.
Yeah, I mean, particularly this attack on the syllogism, which I think it's not as good as he thinks, because we all use syllogistic reasoning, but because we haven't been taught it ourselves properly, we're not quite aware of the way Aristotle was doing it. And it's not Aristotle wasn't as bad. He was trying to be aware of the probabilistic nature of truth in many situations, and he also was able to say that when something was purely rhetorical. And I think Bacon throws out the baby with the bathwater, but his razor-like mind, if you like, I want to use it constructively. And I think that's, if we've got our idea of the teacher right, we take on board all the criticisms and then we try and rethink how we can go forward into the next generation, because that's what teachers do. And you're right, it points towards the Enlightenment and what they can offer us. And I'm sure there's going to be some ups and downs in that as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
On to the next one.
Yeah.